Who were the progressives and how did they seek reform in American society? That's what we're going to be looking at in this video. We've been talking about progressivism. Progressivism being this ideology that society should evolve forward. And the progressives in the progressive era wanted to change parts of society that they believed were problematic. That was their goal, to address the problems arising from a rapidly changing society. You know, with all this industrialization and urbanization, and the country is growing really fast. Some would say too fast. And because of that, there are problems arising like inequality between the wealthy elite and the poor, living and working conditions, and government and politics. So inequality, I mean, look at the picture on the left. You have these wealthy elite aristocrats, right, living this this life of luxury and wealth. And on the other side of society, the majority of people are struggling to get along, right? Struggling to live life, you see in that picture, these children sleeping in the streets, right? They're working long hours. They're barely making any money. They've got coal smears on their face. It's just a difficult life. There's a big gap between the wealthy elite, which is a minority of Americans, and the rest of Americans, the common people. That's the inequality issue. And we have living and working conditions, as we've talked about. You have people in these cities are packed into what are called tenements, these apartments that have just way too many people living in them. So there are sanitation problems, there's overcrowding, obviously, and crime. Anytime you get a lot of people together, there's going to be some conflict, which results in crime. Poverty also is a big component of contributing to a society's crime rate. And on the right, the working conditions, the child labor, the machines that are lopping off people's fingers and arms, the long hours, the low wages. These are real problems that need to be fixed, and the progressives want to do that. And finally, the corruption. A lot of people believe that the corporations, the big businesses at this time, have way too much influence over society. Companies like Standard Oil, Carnegie Steel, the railroad companies. And they believe, ultimately, the biggest problem is that these companies have too much of a voice or say in the government. And so the progressives want to step in and fix that. And so that's what we're going to be looking at, specific reform movements during the progressive era. And while we're doing this, you need to be taking notes. Pretty much everything in yellow is what you need to be writing down. The question on the top, who were the progressives and how did they seek reform in American society? That needs to be the guiding question at the top of your notes. And so let's start where we talked about this already a little bit, the Granger movement and populism. The issue was financial trouble for farmers. That's hard to say really fast. And railroads are charging high rates. The farmers are really struggling during the progressive era and during the Gilded Age right before the progressive era. They're not making enough money to get by, to pay their land and pay for their tools and pay their laborers, and so they're trying to get loans, but the gold standard is keeping them from getting loans. So there's just a lot of problems that they're facing. They end up creating a third party. We call it a third party because it's not the Democrats, not the Republicans. They created their own third party called the People's Party, where they allied with workers and miners, farmers, all allied to form this party for the people, for the common man. And that's going to result in some pretty good things for farmers. One of those is the Interstate Commerce Act. It's a federal law designed to regulate the railroad industry. And so farmers kind of got what they want in this, right? It was too expensive for them to transport their goods with railroads because railroads were charging them exorbitant rates to transport their crops. And now the government is stepping in and regulating the railroad industry. They're also going to get something else they wanted, which was a graduated income tax. The government is going to pass an amendment to the Constitution, the 16th Amendment, and that is going to allow the government to tax people based on their income. So if you make more money, you're going to pay more taxes. And that's good for the common person because the wealthy elite are going to have to contribute more money to the revenue of the government, and that's going to be able to be dispersed into the rest of society. So yeah, on the left, a campaign poster for the Populist Party, and then if you'll remember, in 1896, they're going to put their support behind the Democratic nominee for president, who was William Jennings Bryan, who gives that famous Cross of Gold speech that we looked at. So the second movement is government reform. We talked about the issues are corruption, the influence of corporations and the wealthy elite. And so essentially what the progressives are going to try to do with government reform is give more power to the people, give more of a voice and a say in government to the common man. And we should add here the common man and the common white man, but we'll fix that in a little bit. So one of the first things they do is pass the 17th Amendment, which allows for the direct election of senators. Remember that every state gets 2 senators in the U.S. Capitol, in the legislative branch of the federal government. And it used to be that the state legislators would pick the 2 senators. So the wealthy elite, the people already in power, would choose those 2 senators. So what the 17th Amendment did is it put that choice into the hands of voters, into the hands of the citizens of each state. And that gave more power to the people. We also are giving more power to citizens through some different ways that they can influence government. We've talked about these a little bit before, but let's kind of clarify these. Initiative, when voters introduce a bill to become a law instead of legislators. Referendum, when voters vote directly on a law or proposition instead of legislatures. And recall, when voters remove a public official from office based on an initiative or petition. So let's look at these real quick. So initiative is anytime citizens step up to influence the government. So it could be through a petition or writing letters to congressmen or introducing a law that they think the legislators should consider. It's when the citizens directly act in the government. That's initiative. A referendum is when voters vote directly on a law or proposition instead of legislatures. So this is a new way in the progressive era for American citizens to influence the government. A great example of this in modern times was in 2016 when the state of Nevada, or Nevada, however you pronounce that, decided to let the voters, the people, decide the issue of marijuana. And so they put marijuana on a ballot and said, okay, Nevada citizens, you guys come and vote. And if more of you vote yes, it should be legalized, then vote no, then we will legalize it. And that's what happened. The Nevada voters voted to legalize marijuana, and it is now legal in Nevada. And some other states have had similar referendums. But referendums don't happen that often, because remember, we are a representative democracy. We elect representatives to govern for us. So it's not that often that citizens want to directly deal with a law or proposition or government action. And we also have recall, where we remove a public official, a politician, a representative from their position because they didn't do a good enough job or they're corrupt or for whatever reason. This happened in California when Governor Davis in 2003 was recalled. They pulled him out of office and immediately had a special election. And guess who they elected? The Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger. That's how he got into power in California. So those are the ways that we are giving more power to citizens in the progressive era. This is the government reform that is happening. Now, one of the most important movements happening in this progressive era is that women are stepping up and doing some pretty brave stuff. The women's rights suffrage movement is going on in the progressive era. It's really taking off. And the issues are similar issues that we face today, inequality. Many would argue that today we're still dealing with inequality between men and women. In the workplace, at home, just in society, there seems to still be a different way we treat men and women. Well, back in the progressive era and before the progressive era, it was much worse. So we've made a lot of progress. We're still working on it, but we've made a lot of progress. So inequality was a problem. And before 1920, women were not allowed to vote in most states, and they couldn't vote for national elections like a president. They could not vote for president. So that's one of the things they're going to be working toward. Now, it all starts at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. This is the meeting that launched the women's suffrage movement. Let me move on to the next slide here. There we go. So in 1848, a group of women who decided that it was time to work toward getting the vote for women. And not just the vote, but other rights as well. They had a meeting, a big convention in Seneca Falls, New York, and a lot of women showed up, and also some men, to contribute to the discussion of what they should do to get more rights for women. That's the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention. It's extremely important because it's really the beginning of the modern women's rights movement. So the Me Too movement, all of that kind of stems out of this moment in history in 1848 at Seneca Falls. And so the leaders of the women's rights movement in the Progressive Era and before are really two names I want you to know. First, right here in the middle, is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She's one of the original suffragettes, one of the original women fighting for women's right to vote, but also an equal place in society. And then 2 places to her left is Susan B. Anthony, a name you'll probably recognize, probably the most famous women's rights advocate and the most famous suffragette in the women's rights movement. And so those are the 2 names I want you to write down: Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, 2 powerhouse women fighting for the rights of all women. And ladies watching this video, you owe a lot to these 2 women for stepping up in society and refusing to be treated the way they have been treated in the past. And so the suffragette movement contains a lot of big moments. They form groups like the National Women's Suffrage Association. They protest. They write letters. They fight for decades to get women the right to vote. And the results are that during this time period, women gained the right to control their own earnings and property, where they didn't have that right before. Men controlled that. Their husbands, their fathers controlled their earnings and property, and now women have control of that. And custody of children and divorce. It used to be that divorce laws would favor the man, and during the Progressive Era, they started to become more equal, right? That the judge would give more say to the woman in what happens to the children in a divorce. And of course, the 19th Amendment. You absolutely have to know this one. Underline it, circle it, do whatever you have to do. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. Here's the text of the amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. In other words, you cannot keep someone from voting based on gender. That's what they meant by sex back then. And so this is a really powerful picture, I think, of a woman voting in front of her children. It's incredibly powerful. So this amendment is passed in 1920, 100 years ago this year. It's 2020, so 100 years ago. And so women who get to vote in this election in a month for Trump or Biden, they are voting on the 100th anniversary, of the 19th Amendment, which is pretty cool. And then finally, alcohol, the temperance prohibition movement. This is a movement that we talked about in the 8th grade because it starts in the early 1800s, and the issues that they're trying to deal with are morality, alcoholism, alcohol-related issues, family violence, political corruption. There are people in the Progressive Era that believe that drinking alcohol is wrong, that altering your mental state like that is against their religious ethics. And so they're going to start this movement that we call the temperance movement that's going to lead to a new movement in the Progressive Era called the Prohibition movement. And prohibition is banning something. So you'll guess what prohibition is. And like I said, it starts in the 19th century temperance movement and leads finally to the 18th Amendment, which banned the manufacture, sale, transportation of intoxicating liquors. It banned alcohol. The 18th Amendment started a period in history that we call the Prohibition Era. From 1920 to 1933, the alcohol was illegal, essentially. And they thought this would make society better. And so we saw pictures like this, right, where bars and restaurants and liquor stores are forced to dump their alcohol in the drains because they're out of business officially. This is a police seizing an illegal place where they're manufacturing liquor illegally. We start to see also illegal liquor being made on farms called moonshine. That's where that comes from. Now, it's largely ineffective. The people are going to drink. That's just the way it is. And on the left, you see people in what's called a speakeasy, which is a secret little bar where people would go to drink alcohol when it was against the law. And there actually today you can go to, well, you can't go, but when you are old enough to partake in this, you can go to a speakeasy. It's a little hole in the wall bar that you sometimes have to use a password to get into. And then on the right, we see a guy named Al Capone because he made his money and became powerful in the Prohibition era by selling illegal alcohol. That's how he became so powerful. And so ultimately, the Prohibition era was not successful. It caused more crime and more problems, and people were just really upset generally that they could not drink alcohol. So what did the government do? They repealed the 18th Amendment with the 21st Amendment. That is the amendment that it basically just took back the 18th Amendment and ended the Prohibition era.